Welcome to our deep dive, into this really fascinating world where, like, psychology and law collide. You've given us a whole bunch of legal textbooks and research papers to go through, all focused on how our minds can, like, really play tricks on us, especially when we're talking about deception, those eyewitness accounts, and even how juries make their decisions. We've gone through it all to try to bring you the most interesting and insightful stuff. So are you ready to have all your courtroom assumptions challenged?
Oh, absolutely. I think this is an area just like absolutely ripe with misconceptions. We often think we can spot a liar if we just know a few simple tells, but the reality is so much more complicated.
Yeah. Okay, let's be honest for a second here.
Hmm.
I mean, who hasn't watched like a crime drama and thought, yeah, I could totally beat that polygraph, right? But our sources are suggesting that those lie detector tests, they're not really as foolproof as they seem on TV.
You're absolutely right. The science behind lie detection is a lot more nuanced than those TV shows make it seem. So let's start with the control question test, or CQT, which is something that's commonly used in criminal investigations. And the theory behind it is you're comparing your physiological responses, so things like your heart rate and your sweating, to relevant questions about a crime with control questions about general honesty. So the idea is that if you're innocent, you'd react more strongly to those control questions because technically you're lying about those. But if you're guilty, you're going to react more to the relevant questions.
Yeah, that seems to make sense on the surface. But what if someone is just like a really anxious person? I mean, even if they're innocent, wouldn't that throw off the results?
Exactly. That's one of the major flaws of the CQT, and it's often called the Othello error. And the idea is that an innocent person who's worried about being falsely accused can show those same physiological responses as someone who's guilty. And it really highlights the fact that lie detection, it's not just about measuring those physical responses, it's about trying to understand the context and the individual's like baseline behavior.
So it sounds like it's more about understanding the why behind certain behaviors instead of just relying on, these really simplistic tells. And speaking of behavior, some of our sources actually look at the analysis of Bill Clinton's grand jury testimony during that whole Lewinsky scandal.
Right. And in that analysis, the focus was on nonverbal behavior. So things like his posture, like gaze aversion, and even those really subtle micro expressions. So experts are looking for these kinds of cues that go beyond just the physiological data from a polygraph. For example, Clinton displayed really rigid behavior, and he would look directly into the camera whenever he was asked about his secretary, Betty Curry. But of course, it's really difficult to definitively say if those behaviors were, because of deception or just, maybe his reaction to those specific questions.
That's interesting because it shows how those experts, they apply that behavioral analysis in, a really high-stakes situation. It's not just theory. You can actually see how they break down all those subtle cues. It seems like context is key here. You can't just look at one single behavior and then be like, aha, they're lying.
Exactly. And while we're on this topic of different approaches, there are also techniques that analyze what someone actually says to assess their truthfulness.
Oh, that sounds really interesting. You mean like analyzing the words that someone uses to figure out if they're being honest?
Yeah, precisely. And one method is called criteria-based content analysis, or CBCA. And this is often used in something called statement validity assessment, particularly with child witnesses. And this involves looking at a statement for 19 specific verbal criteria that, in theory at least, differentiate truthful accounts from fabricated ones.
So instead of looking at how someone acts, we're actually looking at like the specifics of their story itself.
You got it. But there's a catch. The validity checklist that's used along with CBCA, it can be pretty subjective, and it relies on assumptions about behavior that might not be accurate for everyone. So, for instance, inconsistencies between statements don't automatically mean someone is lying. They could just be remembering things differently, or maybe they're just providing more detail as they go along.
So even with these content analysis techniques, there's still room for interpretation and a chance for error.
Absolutely. And that's a really important takeaway for anyone as you're navigating this whole world of information. Lie detection, it isn't about finding like a magic bullet. It's about trying to understand the complexity of human behavior, recognizing that there are limitations to these techniques, and then approaching claims of deception, with some healthy critical thinking.
It's a good reminder that we can't always rely on those dramatic lie-detected moments that we see in those TV shows. The reality is so much more nuanced and complicated.
Absolutely. And speaking of nuance, let's move on to another really important area where psychology and law, they kind of intersect. This often misunderstood world of eyewitness testimony. You might never watch those courtroom dramas the same way again.
Yeah, those courtroom dramas, they really make it seem like eyewitness testimony is like, the gold standard, right? But like you said, our sources reveal some pretty surprising flaws in all that, and it might just change how you see those shows forever. Yeah, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? I mean, it's not as simple as they make it out to be. Like, are there certain things that can affect how accurately a witness remembers something or identifies someone?
There are, and these are things called estimator variables, and those are basically factors that can impact how accurately a witness remembers and identifies a suspect. And these are things that, are totally outside the control of the legal system.
So even if a witness is, really trying to be truthful, their memory can still be messed up by outside factors. What kind of things are we talking about here?
We're talking about stuff like the witness's age, how stressed they were at the time, even the lighting or, whether or not there was a weapon present.
Hold on, wait a minute. You're telling me that seeing a weapon can actually make you less reliable as a witness?
Yeah.
How does that even work?
Well, there are actually a couple theories about that. One is called attentional narrowing. So the idea is that the weapon, it grabs so much of your attention that you miss other details. It's like if you have a spotlight that's shining on the weapon and then everything else just kind of fades into the background.
That's a really good way to put it. Like, you're so focused on that threat that you don't even notice all the other stuff.
Exactly. And then the other theory is called surprise or unusualness. So the idea with this one is that if you see something unexpected, like a weapon in a place where you wouldn't normally expect one, it kind of disrupts that normal processing of everything, and it makes the memory less clear.
Mm.
There's this study that shows this perfectly. They had witnesses watch this scenario where there was either a priest or a police officer, and they were carrying either a gun or a cell phone. What they found was really interesting. Witnesses remembered less about the priest when he was the one holding the gun because it was so out of context. But with the police officer having the gun, it didn't have the same effect.
So it's not just about, how dangerous something is, but about whether or not it's unexpected.
Yeah.
Right? Like what goes against, how we expect things to be. It's like our brains get all thrown off and then the memories suffer for it. That's crazy.
Yeah.
So then what about the way police get testimony from people? Do those procedures matter too?
They absolutely do. Those are called system variables, which basically means they're factors within the legal system that can influence how accurately someone identifies a suspect. So we're talking about lineups, mugshot books, the way someone is questioned. All that can have an impact.
So even if a witness is like, really trying hard to be accurate, the way they're questioned or the way the lineup is done can still mess up their memory.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's true. One problem that happens is the repeated identification effect. So let's say a witness looks through a ton of mugshots, but the actual person who committed the crime isn't even in there. Later, when they're shown a lineup, they're actually more likely to pick someone whose picture they saw earlier, even if that person is completely innocent.
That's scary. So just seeing a mugshot, even of an innocent person, can increase the chance that they'll misidentify someone later on. But why would that even happen?
It could be due to something called unconscious transference, which is where they recognize a face, but they can't remember where they saw it before. Or it could be commitment bias, where once they've made a choice, they kind of stick with it, even if they start having doubts later on.
Wow. And the research from Mimon and his colleagues really shows this. They found that even if someone doesn't pick anyone out from those mugshot books, just seeing all the faces makes them more likely to pick someone from a lineup later on, even if it's not the right person.
Yeah.
It's really powerful. I mean, it shows how easily our memories can be changed.
It really is. We often think of our memories like they're these perfect recordings, but that's not how it works at all. Our minds, they try to fill in gaps, they make connections, and sometimes those connections, they can lead to errors.
Okay, so that brings us to this big question, right? If even a completely honest witness can have their memory distorted, how can we ever be sure that, the right outcome is happening in court?
That's a really important question, and it's one that legal systems around the world are constantly dealing with. Eyewitness testimony is super powerful, but it's also incredibly vulnerable to all these subtle influences. And it's so important to be aware of these factors when you're evaluating this kind of evidence, not just in legal situations, but also in everyday life.
So we can't just take things at face value. We have to be critical thinkers, not just, passively accepting everything we're told. We need to question our assumptions, look for other evidence, and remember that even our own memories can be messed up.
Exactly. And now that we've gotten through some of the complexities of eyewitness testimony, let's move on to the final stage of this whole process, the jury. How do they make sense of all this information that could be totally unreliable to figure out if someone is guilty or innocent?
Right, because you've got a witness who might not be reliable, maybe some iffy evidence, a defense attorney who's really good at their job. So how does a jury actually decide? Our sources seem to think it's not as straightforward as we think.
You're right, it's not. Jury decision-making is like this fascinating combination of psychology and law. It's not just about what evidence is shown, it's also about social dynamics, biases, and even just how the information is presented during the trial.
Okay, so let's talk about something that I think we've all noticed. Looks. Do attractive people really get treated better in court? I mean, it doesn't seem fair, but our sources are saying there might be some truth to it.
It's interesting, the research on physical appearance. It's not a huge effect overall, but studies have consistently found that attractive defendants are seen as more trustworthy and less likely to be guilty.
That's honestly kind of unsettling. It's like we all have this unconscious bias, even when we think we're being totally objective. Our brains, they make these split-second judgments about people based on how they look, and those judgments can sneak into our decision-making, even for something as serious as a trial.
It raises some really important questions about how we can try to create a justice system that's truly blind to these kinds of things that shouldn't matter.
Hmm.
But, while we're on the topic of bias, our sources also talk about something called the black sheep effect, which suggests that jurors can actually be harsher on people from their own group.
Wait, really? That seems kind of backwards. Wouldn't you think people would be more lenient towards someone they identify with? Why would they be harder on them?
Well, the theory is that when someone from your in-group does something that reflects badly on the group as a whole, jurors might try to distance themselves from that person by judging them more harshly. It's like a way to protect the group's reputation, even if it means being unfair to one individual.
So it's like saying, see, we don't think that kind of behavior is okay. We're not all like that.
Exactly. But of course it's complicated and it depends on things like, how strong the evidence is and the social context of case. But it shows how these subtle social and psychological dynamics can influence even something that seems simple, like, a jury's decision. And then, we have to talk about the big one, pre-trial publicity.
Oh, yeah, because we all know that media coverage can get pretty sensationalized and biased. But can it actually change a verdict? Can all that stuff that comes out before the trial actually affect how the jury decides?
Yeah, the research on that is actually pretty clear. A meta-analysis of 44 different studies found that negative pretrial publicity consistently leads to more guilty verdicts, even when jurors think they're being totally impartial.
Wow, that's pretty alarming.
Yeah.
It's like we don't even realize how much all that information is affecting us. Like it can be totally subconscious and shape our perceptions even when we think we're being objective.
Exactly. It's like our brains are getting primed by all this pretrial information, even if we don't realize it. Negative pretrial publicity can change how we interpret the evidence, make us more likely to believe negative things about the defendant, and even affect how we remember the trial itself.
And there's this study by Hope, Memon, and Majorge that really shows this. They had people acting as jurors read either a bias or neutral news article about a defendant before taking part in a mock trial. The jurors who read that biased article were way more likely to say the defendant was guilty, even though the evidence in the trial was exactly the same for both groups.
It just goes to show how much influence media coverage can have on these jury decisions. But, it's not totally hopeless. There are actually things we can do to try to reduce this bias.
Oh, really? So what can be done to kind of minimize the influence of all that pretrial publicity?
Well, for one thing, a change of venue can be requested. So they move the trial to a place where the case hasn't been in the news as much.
And during jury selection, which is called voir dire, the attorneys can ask potential jurors about, whether they've seen anything about the case and if they already have any opinions about it.
Right. And judges can issue gag orders that limit what can be reported about the case, especially during, sensitive parts of the investigation or the trial.
Those kinds of safeguards are so important, but even with them in place, pre-trial publicity is still something to be concerned about when we're trying to make sure trials are fair. It really shows how important critical thinking is, not just for jurors, but for anyone who sees, news coverage about these cases. We have to be aware of how easily we can be influenced by all that information.
I completely agree. It's a good reminder that we all have a role to play in making sure the legal system is fair and just. Now for our last topic, let's get into one of the most complicated and debated areas where psychology and law come together: repressed and recovered memories.
All right, everyone, buckle up, because
Yeah.
this is where things get really interesting. Our sources go deep into this topic, and the science is complicated and kind of unsettling.
It is. Let's start with the idea of repression, which comes from Freudian psychology. It's the idea that traumatic memories can get pushed down into our unconscious minds, basically blocked from our awareness to protect us from psychological pain.
It makes sense, and it's a really powerful idea, but Our sources say there's actually not much scientific evidence to support the idea of repression like that.
That's true. The concept is definitely interesting, but there's not a lot of solid proof to back up the idea that memories are completely blocked like that. But then, how do we explain those recovered memories? If they weren't repressed, where did they come from? It really is a tough question. And, this whole idea of recovered memories, it's a sensitive topic, but a super important one, especially when we're dealing with cases that involve children. The stakes are so much higher. We have to be extremely careful about how we gather information, making sure we don't accidentally influence their memories or, cause them even more distress.
Absolutely, and that's where understanding, child development and memory,
Hmm.
it becomes so crucial. We can't just treat kids like they're little adults,
Right.
right? Their cognitive abilities, how they respond emotionally, their whole understanding of the world, it's all different.
Right. And that's why we have to be aware of, what those key differences are when it comes to how children remember things.
Okay, so what are some of those key differences? Like, what do we really need to keep in mind when we're dealing with children's memories?
Well, one of the biggest things is time. Studies show that even really young children can give you accurate information about what happened, but their memories, like all of ours, they fade over time.
Yeah.
And that fading, it happens even faster for younger kids. There's this research from Salmon and Pipe in New Zealand, and they found that, after a year, the accuracy of what 6-year-olds remembered, it stayed pretty much the same, but for 4-year-olds, the accuracy went down a lot.
So it's like the sooner you can talk to a child after something happens, the better their chances are of giving you a reliable account,
Right. All
right?
right. Yeah, that's definitely a big takeaway. But it's not just about being quick. It's also about how you talk to them. Open-ended questions are super important. Instead of leading a child with specific details or just asking yes or no questions, you want to encourage them to describe what they remember in their own words.
So it's more about giving them the freedom to tell their story without, feeling like they have to stick to a certain script or say what they think the adult wants to hear.
Exactly. You're trying to create this safe space where they don't feel judged and where they feel comfortable sharing what happened to them. And it's not even just about the words you use, it's also your attitude. Kids are really good at picking up on those subtle cues like your tone of voice, your body language, even your facial expressions. If they get the sense that you're impatient or skeptical or judging them, they're probably not going to be as open, or they might even change their answers to try to please you.
So basically, you have to build that trust and rapport with them. You want the child to feel like they're being heard and believed and that you respect them.
Absolutely. And here's another thing to think about: your authority as the interviewer. Research suggests that children can be more easily influenced by people they see as authority figures. They're more likely to kind of go along with what someone in a position of authority says, even if it goes against what they actually experienced.
So even if you're not trying to lead the child, your position of authority could still unintentionally affect how they answer your questions.
That's exactly why training and awareness are so important. We need to make sure that anyone who works with children has been trained in these developmentally appropriate interviewing techniques and that they understand how their authority can, accidentally influence a child's memories.
And that brings us to another really important point that our sources brought up, preventing contamination of a child's memory.
Right. It's like what we were talking about earlier with the misinformation effect. If a child is exposed to misleading information after something has happened, it can actually change their memory and sometimes even create totally false memories. This could be from things like media coverage or conversations with other witnesses or even family members who are, just trying to understand what happened.
Yeah, it's like that game of telephone we talked about.
Mm,
Every time a story is told again, new details can get added or things can get twisted. And it becomes hard to tell what really happened from what someone suggested might have happened.
exactly. And children, because their cognitive abilities are still developing and they're more susceptible to suggestion, they're especially vulnerable to that kind of contamination. Protecting their memories from being changed, it's so important.
So how do we go about doing that? How do we actually protect those memories?
That's where forensic interviewing comes in. These are specific protocols that are designed to get information from children in a way that's right for their age, that doesn't lead them to certain answers and that minimizes the risk of their memories being contaminated. The focus is on open-ended questions, letting the child tell the story in their own words and avoiding language that suggests things or puts pressure on them.
So it's a more structured and scientific way to interview kids that's made just for them.
Exactly. And the good news is that there's been a lot of progress in this area. We have much better training programs now for professionals who work with children. There have been legal changes that recognize the importance of these child-friendly interviewing methods. And there's ongoing research that helps us improve these techniques even more.
That's good to hear. Sounds like there's more awareness now of these issues, and people are really committed to making the system better so that kids are protected.
Definitely. But like with all this stuff in psychology and law, it's an ongoing thing. We're always learning more. There's more research to be done. And we're always looking for ways to make sure we're getting accurate information from children while also protecting them.
This whole deep dive has been such a journey. It's been really interesting to learn about all these complex and nuanced topics. We've gone from lie detection to eyewitness testimony to what happens in juries. The fact that our memories can be so unreliable, those false confessions, and the unique challenges of talking to children. It's really clear that our minds are amazing, but they can also make mistakes, especially when we're dealing with legal stuff.
I agree. It's fascinating. And the intersection of psychology and law, it's always changing. There's always something new to discover. And if we understand these psychological principles, it can make us more informed, help us think more critically, and just give us better tools to navigate a world where the truth can be so hard to find.
This deep dive has really given me a lot to think about, and I hope it's done the same for you, our listener. We've seen how our minds can be both our biggest strength and our biggest weakness when we're trying to figure out what's right and wrong. So next time you're watching one of those courtroom shows or reading a news story about a case, remember everything we've talked about today. Question what you think critically about the evidence, and don't forget about how powerful, but also how limited our minds can be.
Stay sharp, everyone. Keep thinking critically.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into psychology and law. We'll see you next time. But until then, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep exploring this amazing world we live in.